I'd like to continue our discussion on George Harrison and George's search for the spiritual in his life. His early childhood was a childhood of searching. He found this great love for music and met Ringo and Paul and John. They clicked together, formed a great act, and at this point in his career, he's extremely successful. The Beatles are a phenomenon, a worldwide phenomenon. Wherever they go, screaming crowds, their records sell out. It's just an amazing experience that George is having. He really can't comprehend it. Difficult to process something like that when a success happens so intently and so quickly, of course. Uh, in June of 1965, to kind of take him at this point in his career where he's successful but still searching. George meets Ravi Shankar, and Ravi agrees to give George lessons on the sitar. He had picked up the sitar and used it in Norwegian Wood on one of the Beatles albums, but uh, really not that well versed in it. He just kind of was fooling around with it and used some of his skills from guitar playing, but didn't really know how to play it. So Ravi says, I'll give you some lessons. Uh, George had found at this point what he was looking for. The material success with the Beatles had not satisfied, though, his inner self. But he had found something in this Indian music that was very special. And of course, we reflect back to his mother during the pregnancy, listening to Indian music. We don't know if, of course, this had an effect, but when he found this Indian music, when he found this mentor, uh, a certain kind of peacefulness came over George. And he knew that he had found something that was going to be very important and meaningful in his life. Uh, he found this sacred music that Ravi was playing much more fulfilling than LSD, which he found very shallow and crude compared to the sacred music. And it's interesting, many times we say that, for the artist, drugs might be the key or drugs might be important. Or they go through a phase where they get very involved with drugs. George never involved that much with drugs, certainly experimented with them, and he did take LSD and marijuana. Uh, but he found something special here. And comparing it to his experience with LSD, he said, gee, this is nothing. I mean, LSD is very crude and simple and doesn't really unlock the heart and the soul the way this sacred music did. The sacred music for him way transcended any experience with LSD or any other drugs. At this time also, it was very interesting in terms of what the Beatles were going through. John Lennon had made a comment about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. And it was an interesting comment. And there was some truth to it in a certain sense. I mean, wherever the Beatles went, they were mobbed, their records sold out, young people gravitated towards them. You could see what John was saying, that religion had kind of lost its appeal in a certain way to young people, whereas the Beatles had no problem appealing at all. And John was reflecting somewhat of a truth. And of course, he got really criticized deeply for it. Many religious people got offended and said, how can you compare what you're doing to what Jesus did? But I think he hit upon something in terms of popularity, people's response, particularly young people who were mobbing the Beatles wherever they went. The Beatles, were fearing for their safety at some of these events. The adulation was so intense. So I think maybe that's more what John was reflecting. I don't think he really meant it as a put down to Jesus or religion, just really reflection on where people were at that particular point in time. In August of 1966, August 29th, the Beatles gave their last concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. And George and Patty, his wife, went to India 2 weeks later. He resumed working with Ravi, and he read the Raja Yoga and embraced the message that all people possess innate and eternal perfection. And he saw this as a very important principle, that there is something within the person, something innate to everyone, it's universal. And they possess this really perfection within themselves. They can find this peacefulness, this encounter with the divine, this holiness within themselves. And of course, Jesus reflected that in the scriptures when he says, the kingdom of God is within a person. You know, so many times we look outside to exterior things to satisfy us, to make us happy, to complete us. And we get that material possession, and it's great for a while. We enjoy it, and then it's like it kind of loses its power a bit. And we're like, is that all there is? You know, my heart is searching for more. And of course, St. Augustine reflected this when he said, our hearts are restless till they rest in thee, speaking about that relationship with God. So very important that we become one with our God. We become united with our God and find within ourselves that perfection. And that perfection is that gift that God gives us, that gift of love. And that's what George found at that particular point. And he also embraced another principle that was extremely important. That is the principle of what we call yama, and that is the need for self-restraint. George had seen the difficulty when there is no self-restraint. He had seen the excesses of drinking, of drugging, of sexuality, and he saw the negatives of that and how that was not making people happy. It was very temporary happiness, temporary pleasure. But it left you ultimately saying, is this all there is? So when there is self-restraint, there is a lot that is achieved through that self-restraint. A lot of the sense of the self, the importance of the self, the importance of also sharing what we have with others when we restrain ourselves. The importance of respect for others by our self-restraint. Sometimes we don't lash out at others, we restrain ourselves from a remark that we might make too quickly, a negative remark. So the importance of restraining ourselves, we always have that principle, you know, think before you act. And of course, we see it violated all the time where people just kind of blurb out any thoughts they have. And, you know, what George is saying here is, you know, it's important to have this self-restraint if we're going to develop ourselves and our personalities. And George realized that chastity was needed for mental strength. So we embraced this discipline of chastity, sense of meeting all of these women, having affairs with them, one-night stands. That was not really gaining him anything. And so being a chaste person is important in life. Sometimes people kind of put down chastity as an old-fashioned virtue, but George saw it in a different light. He said, when you are chaste and you practice this self-restraint, you can really devote your energy to other things that are going to be ultimately for you more fulfilling and lead you to a path of greater happiness. And George also embraced this principle at this time through his reading and through his encounters with Ravi. Never produce pain in any living being through thought, through word, or deed. So, through this self restraint, through this chastity, we don't bring pain into the life of another. And we don't want to bring pain by our thoughts, thinking bad thoughts about someone. It's better to restrain those thoughts, direct them in another direction. And certainly by our words. Our words can be hurtful and painful. And George said, much more important to restrain and to use our words in a positive way. And finally, through our deeds, through our actions, we don't want to produce pain in another person. So we can see George beginning to embrace this new path of spirituality under the influence, certainly, of Ravi Shankar, and also through the Raja Yoga readings that he had been encountering. This led him to a deeper sense of who he was and the importance of restraint and the importance of love for other people.